Welcome to another Explainer. I am so glad you're joining me today because we are tackling one of my absolute favorite concepts. When we think about history, we usually just picture this rigid list of dates, battles, and names we're supposed to memorize. But history isn't just a sterile list of facts. It's a living, breathing narrative. And it is profoundly shaped by how it's recorded, and maybe even more importantly, by who is doing the recording. The medium is literally just as important as the message itself. So today, we're going to explore how three totally different methods of documentation have completely transformed our understanding of the past. Okay, let's dive right into this. On our agenda today, first up, we'll examine how the historical record is shaped overall. Second, Dorothea Lange and the Dust Bowl. Third, Dr. Seuss at war. Fourth, Islamic historiography. And finally, the succession narratives.
Section 1. Shaping the historical record. How history is recorded, hidden, and constructed.
We're kicking things off by looking at how the historical record is actually built. And it's pretty fascinating when you realize that whether someone is pointing a camera, projecting a film, or passing down an oral tradition, they aren't just passive observers. They're actively constructing a reality for us to consume. So the key takeaway here is this. History is rarely just what happened. There's this constant tension between documentation and manipulation. And throughout this explainer, I really want you to keep this central idea in the back of your mind. For every historical event we remember, there were deliberate choices made about what to show you, and just as critically, what to hide from you.
Section 2. Lange and the Dust Bowl. The power of the lens. So let's head back to 1930s America for our first case study. We're looking at the documentary photography of Dorothea Lange. She was a woman who bravely dragged her heavy, bulky Graflex camera out of the safety of a portrait studio and literally right into the dust. During the Great Depression, Lange was hired by the Roosevelt administration's Farm Security Administration, or the FSA. And between 1935 and 1939, her haunting images captured the real plight of the nation's poor. We're talking sharecroppers, displaced families, and incredibly weary migrant workers. She documented these cardboard and plywood Okivilles scattered all across California's Central Valley. And by doing that, she showed the raw, undeniable visual reality of the era to a public that desperately needed to understand the sheer scale of the crisis.
But here's the thing. Lange wasn't just snapping pictures. She was a true documentarian who understood the absolute power of context. She systematically paired her images with the direct and honestly often heartbreaking quotes of her subjects. She'd write down these desperate pleas like, "Something is radical wrong. I don't believe the president knows what's happening to us here." By combining those words with her own detailed observations, like how these totally destitute families were planting flowers around flimsy makeshift shacks just to hold on to a sliver of dignity, she was actively shaping New Deal empathy. She was taking these cold, overwhelming statistics of nationwide poverty and translating them into undeniable human stories.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the incredible twist in Lange's career, which perfectly illustrates the duality of narrative control. See, the government heavily championed her FSA photos because they intentionally built empathy for their own New Deal programs. But when World War II broke out, Lange took an assignment for the War Relocation Authority, the WRA, to document the forced evacuation of Japanese Americans into internment camps. Her photos were so compelling, so humanizing, and so implicitly critical of the forced relocation that the Army actually impounded them. They were literally hidden from the public and from Lange herself for over 20 years. It's wild. Same photographer, same medium, but a completely different government reaction based entirely on the narrative they wanted to construct. Now, despite having her later, incredibly important work censored by the very authorities who previously praised her, Lange remained a dedicated documentarian right up to the end of her life in 1965. In an interview right before she passed away, she reflected on her life's work, and she beautifully described a photograph as an act of love. She sincerely hoped that by looking closely at others, we would ultimately understand ourselves.
Section 3. Seuss at War. The power of the screen.
Just as the U.S. government used Lange's still photos to shape the story of the Great Depression, they used Theodore Geisel's moving films to shape the story of the Second World War. Now, we know him better today as Dr. Seuss, and Geisel's journey to becoming a military propagandist is quite the story. He attended Dartmouth College with the class of 1925, where he actually edited the college's humor magazine, the Jack-o'-lantern. But this was during Prohibition, and he and 9 buddies got caught sharing a single pint of gin. His punishment? He was unceremoniously booted as editor. But to get around this ban, he just started sneaking his cartoons into Spring Edition under various aliases, eventually landing on simply Seuss. It's crazy to think that years later, this exact same subversive, whimsical cartoonist would completely pivot to creating major live-action military training documentaries for the U.S. Army.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer power of the screen to engineer a very specific mindset. In 1944, Geisel worked on a top-secret propaganda documentary called Your Job in Germany. It was designed to tell American troops exactly what to expect after an eventual Nazi surrender. The film carried this incredibly ominous, heavy message. It sternly warned the troops. The Nazi Party may be gone, but Nazi thinking, Nazi training, and Nazi trickery remain. The German lust for conquest is not dead. It was explicitly designed to shape the post-war narrative and the psychological readiness of the soldiers. General Dwight Eisenhower gave it his full enthusiastic approval. General George Patton, on the other hand, famously panned the film with a single one-word profanity and walked right out of the screening room.
Section 4. Islamic Historiography. The Power of Memory.
Okay, we're going to transition now to a much more macro level. We're pulling all the way back from 20th century America to 7th century Arabia to explore a totally different medium. We're looking at how oral traditions are transformed into permanent written history, shaping the very foundations of one of the world's major religions. To really get this, we need to define some foundational concepts. First up is the Sirah. Now, early Islamic history wasn't instantly recorded in massive textbooks the second it happened. It was primarily transmitted orally, straight from memory, for generations. It really wasn't until much later, particularly during the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, that these vibrant, detailed oral traditions were carefully codified and written down into texts like the Sirah, which are the traditional biographies of the Islamic prophet Muhammad.
And right alongside the Sirah, we have the Hadith. These are the deeply respected, compiled records of the sayings and the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Together, the Sirah and the Hadith serve as the absolutely crucial tools for historians, scholars, and believers alike to understand the early Islamic community and the monumental, world-shifting events that shaped its early trajectory.
Which brings us to the Saqifa. This was a pivotal gathering of the Ansar, the local inhabitants of Medina, to choose a new leader immediately after Muhammad's death. This critical meeting resulted in Abu Bakr being selected as the first caliph. And honestly, it is arguably one of the most consequential meetings in all of human history, because it set up the incredibly complex succession disputes that would fundamentally define the Islamic world for centuries to come.
Section 5. The Succession Narratives, from Oral Tradition to Written Record. So how that specific meeting at Saqifa and all the intense events surrounding it were remembered and eventually written down is the core of our final case study. Let's map this out and see how this builds into a really rapid sequence of events. In the year 632, the Prophet Muhammad passes away. Immediately, you have the meeting at Saqifa and the election of Abu Bakr. But this major transition, it was not entirely smooth. By December of that exact same year, Abu Bakr is fighting the fierce battle of Yamama during the Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy, to desperately reunite the Arabian Peninsula under Islam. And incredibly, by 633, the newly unified Rashidun Caliphate immediately initiates the invasion of Syria and Iraq. It is just a breathtakingly fast sequence of history-altering events.
But how you interpret the start of that entire timeline depends completely on the narrative you follow. Take the event at Ghadir Khum, which occurred before the Prophet's death. According to the texts, Muhammad declared, "Ali is my Mawla." After centuries of compiling the various oral histories, two distinct interpretations solidified. The Sunni view interprets the word Mawla as a statement of deep respect and friendship for Ali, but strictly without implying political succession. This, in turn, validates Abu Bakr's later election at Saqifa. The Shia view, however, interprets this exact same event as Muhammad explicitly appointing Ali as his rightful political and spiritual successor, which thereby makes the events at Saqifa illegitimate. And these aren't just academic, philosophical differences in historical documentation, they had very real world-shaping consequences. These differing historiographical interpretations ultimately manifested into profound political and social upheaval, most notably culminating in the First Fitna. This was a tragically prolonged civil war during Ali's eventual caliphate that permanently deepened the Sunni-Shia divide. The way the oral history was remembered, selectively passed down, and eventually codified, quite literally reshaped the geopolitical map of the world.
So from Dorothea Lange's powerfully censored photography, to Dr. Seuss's carefully engineered military propaganda, to the profoundly impactful oral histories of the early Islamic caliphates, we can see that the historical record is never just a simple mirror. It's a crafted artifact. The people behind the lens, the screen, and the pen all have a really heavy hand in shaping the reality we inherit. So as you continue your own journey of learning, I want to leave you with this question. If the lens, the screen, and the pen all shape the story, how well do we really know the history we've been taught? Always check your sources, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.